So today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is Rachel Kline. Rachel is a historian with the U.S. Forest Service, but today is speaking in a personal capacity. Her presentation is drawn from her dissertation entitled We Feminine Foresters, Women, Conservation in the USDA Forest Service, 1850 to 1970. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guest, Rachel Kline.
All right, thank you, Jamie, and to the Forest History Society for hosting me today. And good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to those of you east of me. I'm going to get my screen set up, so give me a second. Let's see here. There, can you just give me a cue, Jamie, if you can see it?
You're good.
Great. All right. Well, I'm really delighted today to share with you all some of my work on rethinking our narratives within environmental history, and in particular, our American land ethic to include women. As Jamie mentioned, my personal research has focused on women's roles in conservation, and specifically within the USDA Forest Service. So researching this topic for a number of years, I found numerous women within our American environmental conversations, and a number of historians and scholars who have given them treatment. Writers like Carolyn Merchant, Nancy Unger, Vera Norwood, and Robert Musil, to name just a few. But it always strikes me as odd, or frankly sad, when I open up a nature-inspired journal or a wall calendar that I bought at Barnes & Noble, full of quotes, and I see only male conservationists quoted. There's typically some women quoted, but they're often from the literary genre. And besides Rachel Carson, there's just female conservationists are rarely seen. So why is this? Why aren't women in our mainstream discussions about and history of environmentalism in the US? And I think that the short answer is twofold. And that is that emerging scientific and professional conservation positions excluded women until the late 20th century, but more so that historians have not really included them in their work until very recently. And there are plenty of wonderful books by authors I previously mentioned, but as a field, environmental history is still not fully incorporating female voices into its mainstream discussions. These stories are still relegated to women's history and are not simply environmental history. So what I would like to do today is rethink some of those narratives that we've been telling and consuming and place women at the center, specifically looking at our American land ethic and recovering what women have been saying within this conversation since 1850. So environmental history is stacked with a constellation of men who've been credited with forming our thinking on nature preservation and conservation. And the simplified mainstream story goes typically something like this. Henry David Thoreau spends time at Walden Pond and publishes his clarion work in 1854, being described as America's founding nature writer. George Perkins Marsh warns of the irreversible and unsustainable aspects of exploitative land use practices in his 1864 book, Man and Nature. John Muir advocates for the preservation of wilderness areas and becomes known as the father of the national parks. President Theodore Roosevelt, our most influential conservationist president, sets aside public land and creates an atmosphere for conservation initiatives to flourish. Gifford Pinchot, the father of the Forest Service and America's first professional forester, calls for the greatest good of sustainable scientific management of the nation's forests. And finally, we arrive at Aldo Leopold, considered to be the father of wildlife ecology and the originator of the very term land ethic, which calls for an ethical, caring relationship between people and nature. So let's pause for a moment with Aldo and the land ethic. Aldo Leopold graduated from the Yale School of Forestry in 1909, and he began a career with the Forest Service, being promoted to forest supervisor for the Carson National Forest in New Mexico at the age of 24. And he was instrumental in developing the proposal to manage part of the Gila National Forest, also in New Mexico, as a wilderness area, the first management area of its kind. And he went on to become professor of game management at the University of Wisconsin, the first professor of wildlife management. So he's certainly a pioneer in the field. Leopold was also a prolific author of nature essays and articles, and his well-known Sand County Almanac in 1949. And this beautifully written book describes what has become known as a land ethic. Leopold described this ethic as an expansion of the definition of community to include not only humans, but all of the other parts of the earth as well, like soils, waters, plants, and animals, or what Leopold called the land. And the Aldo Leopold Foundation writes that, quote, in Leopold's vision of a land ethic, the relationships between people and land are intertwined. Care for people cannot be separated from care for the land. A land ethic is a moral code of conduct that grows out of these interconnected, caring relationships. So from Thoreau to Leopold, we have a story about the development of the American environmental movement that leads us to a land ethic, calling for a moral responsibility to the land. Is this an important and true story? Absolutely. Is it the whole story? Not at all. And what I would like to do with our remaining time today is explore the rest of that story and include women in this amazing conversation we see transpiring over the 19th and 20th centuries, and consider the intellectual roots of a land ethic, or what women called the conservation cause. So following the works of writers Ralph Waldo Emerson and William Bartram, while preceding those of Thoreau and Marsh, like I just mentioned, Susan Fenimore Cooper was an integral voice within these early American nature conversations, and her work laid the foundation for women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But let's take a minute to explore how women's interest in nature appreciation or study was growing during the 19th century, though, before we move on. At that time, women traveled, they hiked, observed, and birded. They turned daily sights into journals, diaries, children's stories. They published articles and illustrations. Women gardened, they sketched wildflowers, they taught children about birds and butterflies. They dabbled in scientific studies like botany and ornithology. And as the frontier eventually filled in from the encroachment of industry and urban life, women lamented the loss of species and organized to advocate for the preservation and protection of wildlife and wilderness. And it was Cooper's observations of nature as part of the home and community that were pivotal in the formation of women's nature appreciation. She provided a model for women to engage with natural subjects and advocate for their preservation as a moral obligation, calling on them to awaken their interest in nature, which may lead them to what she called something higher. So 4 years before Thoreau published Walden, Susan Fenimore Cooper published her Rural Hours in 1850. And some of you may be familiar with her. She was the devoted daughter of James Fenimore Cooper, the famous American author known for Last of the Mohicans. And Rural Hours is the first nature writing text to be published by a woman in the United States. And the book saw 4 decades of success with numerous editions and reprints. It was written in the style of a daily journal, capturing Cooper's observations over a period of 2 years of the seasons, the flora and fauna of her native upstate New York. But more than just daily musings, Cooper saw patterns of climate change, loss of species, and unsustainable environmental practices, and she feared for the loss of the American landscape. And she credited this impending demise to a lack of environmental concern by Americans and what she thought was a misappropriation of European environmental understanding imposed upon American nature. So for example, she complained that the American robin was so named because it had a red breast like the European robin. But our robin actually belongs to the thrush family, not the flycatcher family like the European robin. So this and other numerous examples really bothered Cooper. And throughout her nature writing spanning 43 years, she sought to teach Americans about American nature, not an idealized one based on European poems and stories. More importantly, though, Cooper called upon readers in her Rural Hours to not only recognize American nature accurately, but more so to recognize it with a cultural and national appreciation, her call to something higher. Editors of the 1998 edition of Rural Hours, Rochelle Johnson and Daniel Patterson, they note that the larger purpose of Cooper's work emerges page by page. And that is that Cooper wished to, quote, educate Americans about their natural world, to instill in them a pride of place based on this deeper knowledge, and finally, to convince them of a moral obligation to preserve their environment. So Cooper advocated that Americans approach the landscape, quote, more humbly and gratefully and with less greed, by creating a sustainable balance between humans and nature. And while she praised the social spirit of the land that was modestly shaped by the laborer or the husbandman, she criticized the unsustainable practices of Americans depleting forests and species for the use of one generation. And throughout her works, Cooper repeatedly reported the loss of American wildflower species, the diminishing numbers of migrating birds, the decrease of fish, and the reduction of wildlife like moose, stags, deer, wolves, and martens, all killed for their fur or displaced by woodcutters. And on forestry, she criticized practices like pollarding or lopping the heads off of trees. She called such a mutilation of trees as unethical and a deplorable practice that wasted whole trees for fleeting pursuits of nuts, fruit, or a beehive. And on the exploitation of old growth trees, she remarked, quote, it needs but a few short minutes to bring one of these trees to the ground. The rudest boar passing along the highway may easily do the deed, but how many years must pass ere it equal stands on the same spot? She further lamented, quote, no other younger wood can ever claim the same connection as this, with a state of things now passed away forever. They cannot have that wild, stern character of the aged forest pines. So Cooper's remedy for exploitation was to connect nature and forest to the home as a way for Americans to understand the value of trees and why they should care. Even arguing, quote, in very truth, a fine tree near a house is a much greater embellishment than the thickest coat of paint that could be put on its walls, or a whole row of wooden columns to adorn its front. Nay, a large shady tree in a dooryard is much more desirable than the most expensive mahogany and velvet sofa in the parlor. Writing, quote, the earth is the common home of all, she asserted that Americans had a moral obligation to know and recognize that nature around them. So Susan Cooper's call to something higher planted a seed in the minds of 19th century women to recognize the importance and value of nature, a mantle that women took hold of and expanded into the 20th century. Cooper was quickly followed in print, and the conservation cause among women was begun. We also know that Thoreau read her because he quotes her, revealing that this was certainly a conversation involving both men and women. So who are some of these other women? Elizabeth Wright, Olive Thorne Miller, Celia Thaxter, Sarah Orne Jewett, Edith Thomas, Anna Botsford Comstock, Jean Stratton Porter, and Mary Hunter Austin are just a few who wrote on natural history, the importance of nature, the progressive depletion of the natural world, the need for thoughtful preservation, and the assertion of nature not as other, but as home. In 1918, Mary Austin, who's got the hat in this picture looking really cool, she credited women's capacity for intuitive judgment as their platform from which to speak, stating women should bring to nature writing, quote, not their ability to see the world in the way men see it, but the importance and validity of their seeing it some other way. Women's presence in nature writing was far more pervasive than many now remember. About half the nature essays in the Atlantic Monthly during the late 19th century were contributed by female authors, including Cooper. And the St. Nicholas Children's Magazine included women's articles as well and provided natural science lessons for mothers to teach children. American Forests, the magazine distributed by the American Forestry Association, also featured a number of short stories and poems written by women in each issue. As more women were exposed to environmental concerns through nature writings and essays, books, and magazines beginning with Cooper, amid the growing literary garden and botanical clubs, these ideas germinated to become a huge grassroots movement. And during the Progressive Era, which is about 1890 to 1920, thousands of women took up Cooper's appeal for nature appreciation and preservation and advocated for the protection of birds, forests, and watersheds. Like Cooper, they claimed that preserving American nature would preserve American life. And one direct way women advocated for environmental protection was in the realm of fashion. Women's fashions in the 19th and early 20th centuries prominently featured feathers and actively promoted mass slaughter of wild birds. And so a call to action to save birds from the milliner's hat drew thousands of women together to end the late 19th century fashion of hats lavishly adorned with these feathers. And the millinery practice served as one of the first and largest rallying points of environmental concern for women in the Progressive Era, and transformed their writing into action, advocacy, and political lobbying. Through their efforts, the number of feathered hats purchased and worn were radically reduced and led to the passage of various laws, including a 1913 tariff that outlawed the import of wild bird feathers to the United States, and the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act that established protections for migratory birds between Canada and the United States. And Mabel Osgood Wright, one of the most influential women in the bird preservation movement, she was the author of The Friendship of Nature, Birdcraft, and Birds of Village and Field. And she helped found the Connecticut Audubon Society and served as its first president. She collected news and stories from the initial 19 state societies and reported on the political and grassroots efforts to preserve birds, helping women collectively understand and be part of the movement. Wright's The Friendship of Nature, published in 1894, which was the year Cooper died, took up where Cooper left off in her Lament for the Birds. Wright advocated for the amateur study of ornithology as a window to understanding and appreciating nature, challenging the ruinous effects of an industrializing nation. Wright is just one example of many, many women during the Progressive Era to speak out and write about women's moral obligation to save nature, wildlife, forests, water, and in essence, their homes. And beginning with Susan Cooper and into the Progressive Era, women believed loss of American nature negatively impacted humans in future generations. And preservation and wise resource use, they argued, would save trees, water, soil, wildlife, and really the nation as a whole. And I could spend the rest of the day talking just about women's contributions to the Progressive Era conservation movement. But now I'd like to pivot to a lesser known group of women who radically influenced the nation's largest conservation agency, the U.S. Forest Service. As I was researching these women in the early Forest Service, I kept coming across this phrase that they would use all the time, the conservation cause. And while women engaged in conservation work in various ways over time, a constant thread found throughout their records is their shared conception of this conservation cause based on the greatest good. And Gifford Pinchot captured his, and by extension, the Forest Service's philosophy in his use of the utilitarian maxim, the greatest good for the greatest number, derived from English writer Jeremy Bentham, to which he added, in the long run. And this political philosophy and mission statement for the new agency emphasized that forest management should consider the many needs and interests of forest users and implement long-term decisions that best serve the most people as well as the environment over time. And the question of who is best fit to determine and fulfill that greatest good was answered with the progressive credo of efficient government regulation based on scientific management, what historian Samuel Hayes termed the gospel of efficiency. The men of the Forest Service espoused that utilitarian conservation ethic and implemented the gospel of efficiency through professional forestry and scientific administrations, in their minds guaranteeing fair and wise use of natural resources. Meanwhile, the many women who worked for the Forest Service since its earliest days took conservation and, like Pinchot, they made it their own. While Forest Service women heartily subscribed to the ideal of efficient scientific management, they added to it a deeper environmental concern and tied it to American morality, culture, and citizenship. In their minds, the practice of forestry was not only for the benefit of the lumberman or the carpenter, but also for the cultivation of relationships between tree life and human life. During a time of industrialization and rural flight around the turn of the century, women saw forestry as a means for fostering recognition and appreciation of nature, country life, rural problems, and the welfare of the nation. During the Second World War in mid-century, it was a means of preserving American ethics, resources, and national pride. And for women, the conservation cause was a civic and moral responsibility to conserve nature, as well as people's relationship with the land for the future benefit of American life and values. So let's take a look at some of these women. The first woman I'd like to discuss is Edith Mosier, who worked for the Forest Service from 1905 to 1920. She's known as the founder of conservation education in the agency. And I just love how her story begins. It's almost like a superhero origin story. As an elementary school teacher, Mosier was standing at her blackboard preparing a lesson inspired by a small peach branch that she held in her hand, and it dawned on her. There were no decent instructional books on nature and science in 1900 with which to teach her students. Anna Botsford Comstock's Handbook of Nature Study, if you're familiar with that, had not yet been released. Thoroughly irritated at the lack of accessible and useful nature texts, she vowed to illustrate her own set of nature books for school children. So she bought a ticket to Washington, D.C. She told her boss she was going to attend a teacher's conference, but once she got there, she sold her return ticket. She took a civil service exam, and wham, she was hired by the General Land Office, and she moved to the Forest Service once it was established in 1905, and she didn't look back. And while she was a clerk under Pinchot, she began illustrating those nature texts that she had promised outside of her normal duties. And in 1907, she published her first booklet, Fruit and Nut-Bearing Trees. And the agency saw the value in her work, and they supported her, leading her to publish the second and third booklets, Our Oaks and Maples, and Our Cone-Bearing Trees in 1909. And the hallmark of these nature texts were her full-page illustrations, the roughly 30 close-up scientific illustrations of the various leaves, flowers, seeds, cones, fruit, and branches for each tree that she was discussing. And within the texts, she mixed in scientific observations and lessons for teachers in the back. But while she started out wanting to provide school children with more detailed textbooks, her efforts turned into a larger initiative of sharing with students conservation as a cultural obligation and an entreaty to protect the forests as a civic responsibility. And how she accomplished this was to connect literature, poetry, and thoughts about American life with nature. And she used poetry and verse often to set this stage. So for example, she begins the booklet Oaks and Maples with the poem from William Wordsworth. One impulse from the vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. In 1917, she published Forest Study in the Primary Grades, the first Forest Service textbook for children that had numerous lessons for school teachers, again combining poetry and scientific observations. I think one of her greatest contributions is her poem that gets children to think about fire prevention long before Smokey ever did. What do we burn when we burn our trees? We burn the home for you and me. We burn the carriage house, barn, and shed, the baby's cradle, the little boy's sled, the bookcase, the bookcase, the table, the rocker of ease. We burn all these when we burn our trees. What do we burn when we burn our trees? The homes of birds, the squirrels and bees, the home of the brook and the cooling spring, where violets blossom and bluebirds sing. The beauties of nature, so fair to please, we burn all these when we burn our trees. So this poem and others in her Forest Study in the Primary Grades, Mosier emphasized that learning forest conservation issues as a young student made children better citizens and people. And she argued that with a love for nature and an understanding of that interconnectedness of forests and humans, that children would grow into adults and citizens more apt to solve the pressing issues facing forests and natural resources. Through prose and poetry, she convinced readers to care for and protect forests as a personal responsibility. Her career with the Forest Service was sadly cut short as she developed tuberculosis, but she kept writing for a number of years. Next, I'd like to talk about Daisy Priscilla Edgerton, who worked for the Forest Service Division of Information and Education from 1923 to 1938. In 1927, she authored USDA Circular Number 98, The Forest, a handbook for teachers, which was reportedly a bestseller. And like Mosier, Edgerton used literature and culture as a means of understanding and relating to forestry. She also authored a textbook in 1930, one of the first of its kind, called Southern Forest: First Steps in Forest Study. Edgerton absolutely loved her job and was extremely proud to work for the agency and in conservation. In 1931, she wrote, quote, "There's perhaps no set of women workers in Uncle Sam's army of federal employees more loyal and enthusiastic for the cause and the job than those in the Forest Service." And Edgerton went on to say that if women were removed from the agency, the powers that be would immediately bring them back to make things normal again. Wherever she goes, young forests begin to grow. A children's newspaper wrote in 1940 of Margaret Marchmount. As the director of women's forestry in the Division of Information and Education, she spoke to thousands of women across the country to convince them of their moral obligation to care for nature and trees. Reading this woman's schedule made me tired. She gave talks to women's clubs, she wrote articles, presented lectures, and gave radio addresses sometime in the same days. She spoke about conservation programs, planting trees, and fire prevention, and most importantly, why it all mattered. And in particular, she popularized the Penny Pines campaign, if you've ever heard of that, a children's conservation campaign to encourage students to donate pennies to fund the planting of pines on national forests. And in exchange for every penny given, the Forest Service planted 2 or 3 pine trees. For every $4 received, the Forest Service promised to plant 1,000 seedlings in states where conditions were favorable for growing pines. And she raised so much money for trees, you can still see her forests across the country today. Marchmount also spoke out about fire prevention education, using snappy sayings like, "Chaperone your cigarette, don't let it go out alone." But more than glib sayings, she encouraged women and children to invest personal responsibility in the forests and think about the penny pine forest that they had raised money for and helped to plant, saying, "Do you think our forest is burning, Ma?" In 1942, Marchmount wrote in an article for American Forests magazine that, quote, "No longer is forestry wholly a man's profession. The wonder world of the forest is now a woman's world also." And she outlined that the goal of the women's forestry program in the Forest Service was to make women into forest builders who would protect and guard the forests as their home. She claimed that women could build careers at home as foresters, working on the, quote, human side of forestry. And her program revealed the contrast in men's and women's approach to forest conservation at the time. While the Forest Service men predominantly viewed timber as a crop to be harvested, women desired to build up forests to enhance American life. And in the midst of war, she reminded Americans that while bombs explode, trees grow. And from that assurance, Americans could find resolve to preserve and protect their forests, their homes, and their way of life, even in uncertainty. A couple more women I'd like to mention is Rowena or Nina Booth Owen, who worked from 1906 to 1936 in the Eastern region. She published Forestry for Young Folks, which was a fire prevention guide that stated, to control a fire of 1,000 acres is good. To put out a fire of 1/4 acre is better. But to prevent a fire because you had learned to value the trees and their countless gifts is best of all. In 1929, she developed a short brief called Forest Leaves, Helpful Suggestions to the Teacher, that took segments of Edgerton's circular The Forest and condensed the seasonal lesson outlines for primary and intermediate grades. And she also enhanced children's conservation study with her fictional short stories, The Raindrop Family, Pine Tree Treasures, and The Enchanted Study. For example, The Raindrop Family tells a story of rain and soil erosion if the forest is not properly cared for. Another woman is Lydia Marie Heasley, who worked in the Washington office between 1907 and 1949. And she released Our Forests, What They Are and What They Mean to Us in 1933, which sold 25,000 copies a year for a time. In the tradition of Susan Fenimore Cooper and the 19th century women naturalists and scientists, the well-known Dr. Eloise Jerry, first female research scientist hired in the Forest Service, also connected her scientific findings with community values. In 1924, she wrote a 4-part series of short stories for children featured in American Forests magazine. Called the Pine Burr Stories, each story followed a child's adventure into the woods to inspect trees with father or play with cousins, decorate the Christmas tree made from the delights of the forest, and help plant seeds to grow new forests. She wrote, quote, "Hidden beneath the hard brown scales of the pine burr or cone lie the seeds. Each may unfold its little winged bundle of mystery into a tree. Like these hidden seeds, the lives of the boys and girls who live deep in the southern piney woods also unfold with a varied and picturesque interest." So by connecting the stories to the daily lives of children, Jerry showed the importance of large forests and tiny seeds to young children and put a relatable human face on scientific practice. So these are just a handful of women in the Forest Service and conservation in general who carried out the conservation cause through their work and outreach. And I don't have time today to discuss the many others that were out there. But hopefully you can see now that Rachel Carson is certainly not the only woman in this story, but one carrying on a long and honorable tradition of American women's environmental advocacy. Carson, who was well-grounded in science, embodied what might be thought of as the hallmarks of women's environmentalism in the 19th and early 20th century. She brought to scientific resource management a sense of wonder and sentimental appreciation, encouraging parents to share nature with children. "I sincerely believe," said Carson, "that for the child and for the parent seeking to guide him, it is not half so important to know as to feel. If facts are the seeds that later produce knowledge and wisdom, then the emotions and the impressions of the senses are the fertile soil in which seeds must grow." For women in conservation like Carson, Mosier, Edgerton, and Marchmount, the chief aims were educating Americans about resource issues, taking responsibility for nature, and connecting people with the land. In short, promoting and fostering a land ethic. So let's think again about some of these male founders, Gifford Pinchot and Aldo Leopold, and not just as pioneers in conservation thinking, but rather as persons expressing a way of looking at the world around us that was at least as old as Susan Fenimore Cooper. And long before Pinchot's Greatest Good, or the publication of Leopold's land ethic essay, women within the conservation movement and the Forest Service had championed an American moral obligation to care for the land and recognize humans' deep-seated relationship and interconnectedness with nature. In fact, it was both Pinchot's and Leopold's mothers who had inspired and influenced them in their careers and approach to the land. Mary Pinchot was a great force in Gifford's life, and with her husband James, had encouraged Gifford to pursue forestry. In 1890, she wrote to Gifford saying that he must, quote, "help make a public opinion which will force the government to do what ought to be done," end quote, in order to successfully promote forestry within the country, advice he did follow the rest of his life. And Clara Starker Leopold, Aldo's mother, likewise encouraged his, quote, "skills in observing nature, his writing, and his sense of the aesthetic." Her early cultivation and influence led him to a lifetime vocation as a forester, restoration ecologist, philosopher, educator, writer, and outdoor enthusiast, end quote. Certainly instrumental to the formation of the American environmental mindset and resource management, Pinchot and Leopold were not, however, sole inventors of such ethics, but they were steeped in a long succession of women's conservation ideology. By the end of the 20th century, women had solidly fused their progressive era legacy of a conservation cause with current scientific and technical management to create a modern environmental concern and shared land ethic, which brings a diversity of skill sets to meet a changing agency and the general public they serve. And today, women continue to reflect on that philosophy. Leslie Walden, who's the senior executive for the Work Environment and Performance offered, quote, "I'm not alone among women in the Forest Service in sharing a conservation ethic. This commitment has a shared central ethos that we must work with the people we serve to fulfill our conservation mission." And Dr. Griselle Gonzalez, who is amazing and is the first female director of the International Institute of Tropical Forestry, she added that, quote, "Delivering our conservation mission is about openness and willingness to work across multiple disciplines and a diverse community of partners." And I'll never forget what Gloria Brown said to me once before she passed away, that the essence of her career was about her relationships with the people she worked with and the land she cared for. So in conclusion, I'd like to challenge us today to think about the narratives that we tell and ask who else might have something to say. Environmental historians especially need to think about which sources we're using, prioritizing, and highlighting in our work. There are so many untapped sources, and today I've only scratched the surface on women in conservation. And these stories shouldn't be relegated to simply women's history. They should be part of mainstream environmental history. There are many wonderful books and articles out there that highlight women's contributions to conservation and forest history that need far more attention. And I'd like to spotlight some forthcoming research by Anne Little, who's currently working on a book entitled Natural Women, Nature, Maternity, and Liberty After the Revolution, which is about the generation of women who came of age after the revolution as both observers of nature and the natural, and natural objects themselves through their reproductive capacity and their maternal labor. It will be a new look at women and environmental history in a period that most haven't considered. But before I hand it back to you, Jamie, I'd like to thank a few people for their tremendous and amazing support in this project. My colleague, Leighton Quarles, the wonderful Char Miller, my mentor and dear friend, Anne Little, and finally you, Jamie, who've supported me through this venture. And thanks to you all for joining me today.
Well, thanks, Rachel. I appreciate that. First of all, thank you for the presentation. There's a lot there. Thank you for the compliment. I appreciate that. And it was a privilege to be kind of reading over your shoulder as you were working on your dissertation, being a very outside reader. I learned so much, and I'm going to show your hand a little bit and say that I'm very excited about the prospect of you rolling it over into a book so that the general public gets to read this and tackle and dig into it as well. Just a reminder, folks, that to submit your questions through the Q&A forum, and we do have some in there. Somebody has mentioned that there are women writers who interacted, or asks, are there women writers who interacted with Indigenous land management knowledge? Your discussion of wildfires made them think of intentional burning. So if you could address that.
Yeah, actually, Edith Mosier, the founder of environmental education, after she left the Forest Service due to tuberculosis, I mentioned that she went on to write a few things, and that included some, I forget which tribe, but Indigenous knowledge relating to wildlife and ecological management. So I do know that it was on their minds. I'm trying to think offhand, though, of any other. I know that there were definitely things women wrote about, but not necessarily published through the Forest Service. And that's what my research primarily looked at. But I mean, there's so much to uncover that there's still a lot more to do. So I'm sure it's out there.
Yeah, I do know that women were writing about the use of fire in the late 19th century, what we would call prescribed fire today. Down in Florida, there's an article in our magazine, Forest History Today, published a few years ago about this very topic. The recognition there that fire had an ecological role in the pineries there. So there is so much But thank you for that suggestion of reminding us to also include Indigenous peoples.
Definitely. And I saw Char's question pop up asking for the title, and I'm looking. If I can't find it quickly, I'll definitely provide that though.
Sure.
I probably should just focus and not look.
So we had one person that noted that not only did the mother of Gifford Pinchot and the mother of Aldo Leopold had an influence, but their wives as well. And I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the influence of wives on those in the Forest Service, the rangers and others, how that was part of the larger conservation story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a whole section of women that I unfortunately needed to leave out today. Otherwise, we'd still be going for a few more hours. And so just to briefly think about these wives of early forest rangers, they were typically well-educated, middle-class women who would go out with their, newly married ranger husbands thinking something, and then they'd get to the cabin and they'd be like, oh my God, what did I get myself into? But the women who stayed, they really loved the work. And I remember Dorothea Gray Guck, she writes this really incredible article for American Forest Magazine. And side note, if anybody wants a really cool project, just spending a summer with the American Forest Magazine, there's so much good stuff in there. Anyway, so she writes this article about how she sees herself and other rangers' wives as carrying out this conservation gospel, almost as if their ranger husbands are preachers, and they themselves are carrying out this conservation cause, this gospel as well. And they typically weren't paid for their work, and this work included all of the traditional household duties, cooking, cleaning, boarding, as all of the different foresters came through. But also these women read snow scales, they built fences, they often took care of the whole ranger station as their ranger husband was out patrolling. They answered the phone, they did all the clerical work. They did all of this work. As they moved into the mid-century, they were primarily dispatchers. My grandmother was a dispatcher for a fire when my grandfather, who was in the Forest Service, had to go off and fight a fire. And so they really fostered also the sense of community that is sort of like military families who had to move around a lot. Foresters had to move around a lot as well. And so it was these women who kept that community together, and they really sought to foster that conservation cause in their work. So this is a whole chapter in my dissertation, and that's like a couple minute spiel, but there's so much more about so many other women who I didn't even get to talk about today. The women who served as lookouts, Helen Dow, Hallie Daggett, they talk a lot about as well how they feel about protecting the forests as that lookout, protecting their home. So this language is pervasive throughout women's conservation work, not just in conservation education, where I focused a bit today.
Well, that leads to a question from Ginger Kopp. She asks you to comment on or respond to this. Does it seem as if women were assigned to the soft skills and not technical forestry skills?
Can you say that again, Jamie, so I can hear it?
Sure. She wants to, Ginger is asking you to respond to the comment. Does it seem as if women were assigned to jobs with soft skills? You mentioned administrative or library or research. A real broad classification would be indoor jobs versus the technical or field forestry skills.
Great. It's not because they wanted to, it's because that's what was available. So women, I mentioned this at the very beginning, women were excluded from professional forestry positions or engineer positions because those positions required specific degrees which women were not eligible for. Some women did squeak through and get some forestry degrees, but they were often not allowed because the forestry degrees required that required that the men go to a field school in the summer. And so this was just too scandalous to think about men and women in the same camp in the summer. And oh my goodness, the thoughts, right? So they also thought that the ranger, the forester, needed to be this rugged, educated man who could quickly tally up all of this scientific data, right? But then he could also go chop trees and climb that telephone pole and, you know, fix the wires and all of this work. And so women were not permitted those positions. The first female forester was in the 35, and that's Margaret Stoughton Abel. And she was on the Asheville Experimental Forest. It's called something different at the time. But anyway, she really wasn't allowed to do much field work. I talked about Dr. Eloise Jerry. She wasn't really allowed to do much field work until she just threw a fit and said, I am going out in the field. If you want this data to be correct, you're going to let me. But she still had to have a chaperone, a male chaperone. But because she threw that fit, she ended up nearly saving the turpentine industry in the South. So they wanted to be in the field. The lookout positions that I mentioned were primarily the only field position allowed for women. And even that was a hard one to come by. What's the line, Jamie, for Hallie Daggett? When the ranger's reading the letter, he's like, the first person, you know, he's a drunk. The second person can't see. And like the third person, you know, is no gentleman. But she got the job because she knew the area and she was dedicated. And
sorry to interject, but she's not a drunkard, and she's not a blind, a guy who's half blind and shoots up everything. That was the other part of that guy's qualifications.
I loved that letter.
But the hiring supervisor was advised, I hope you're sitting down and you don't have a heart attack when I tell you who the best candidate is.
Right. Yeah. And Hallie Daggett served 13, 14 years atop Klamath Peak. And the reason she left is because they modernized her cabin and she didn't like it. I think that's hysterical. But so the other women who I talked about, I think maybe what Ginger's getting at with these softer skills, clerical positions, administrative positions, conservation education. Helen Stockbridge, she was the librarian for the Forest Service. She expanded the library from about 500 books to 3,000 in the matter of years. She created branch libraries. A lot of what my dissertation talks about is how these women in clerical positions, while they were excluded from those professional or field positions, they still did their darndest to really impact the agency. And through creating bibliographies, through just keeping the rangers straight. Remember, the rangers are moving around a lot. Well, who's staying put? These women clerics. And they're the ones who are creating they're creating this sort of intellectual system for these rangers to tap into and then go take that information. And so there's a lot of work that these women are doing in these different positions across the agency, all espousing this conservation cause.
Yeah, they're building a knowledge base and a foundation that the others can turn to, putting it at their fingertips, in essence. We have a question. What research is being done to highlight women of color, their work in conservation and environmental work, and or to address why there is a gap as to why we do not necessarily see these women?
Yes. The early Forest Service is primarily a white story, unfortunately. There are a lot of people of color, families of color who do work for the Forest Service, but because they are not in professional positions, because they're not in positions of leadership, we often don't get their records. And so a lot of what we have is just photographs. The things that I often look at, I don't look at the final report. I look at the draft report, because a draft report often shows all those handwritten notes from women, all of those things that went into that final report that has this forest supervisor's name on it, right? So it's taking a look at sources like that that really need explored. And in this women in the Forest Service story in particular, I don't see women of color popping up until maybe the late 40s, the 50s. There were women of color hired at the Forest Products Laboratory. And again, I don't have anything about their names. I don't have anything about their work. I just have their photographs. And so I think it's going to require a bit more digging. But Donna Sinclair has done tremendous work on men and women of color in the Forest Service. She's the co-author with Gloria Brown, Black Women in Green. And so there is that conversation taking place. It just takes place a bit later in the 20th century. And I think our source base is really why we see that.
And for those of you who are interested in, a year ago, February, so February of 2021, Donna did a presentation for us, a webinar, that's out on our YouTube channel. And again, a reminder, that's where you'll find this presentation and all the other previous presentations. And you mentioned Char Miller last June. He gave a presentation on indigenous peoples and wildfire in California. That's another one to check out. So, and a few folks are asking if they might be able to get a bibliography or a list of the women you've spoken about. And I'll put you on the spot and say that we'll work to have that on our website. We'll have some information. Certainly you could rewatch the presentation and take notes as I was doing, because I noticed there were a number of names that you brought up that were not in your dissertation. So now shifting a little bit, Renee Stranad, who's I think with the North Carolina Forest Service. I know she's in environmental education here. She said during a recent forestry-related presentation related to women landowners, there was a great discussion regarding private women landowners. What do you think has caused the shift from these women pioneers in what she terms women's prerogative for conservation to women taking more of a back seat in current conservation, land management, and private forest land ownership? That's something I didn't realize was happening.
I didn't know either. I do know of a lot of women who, again, I didn't get to talk about today. And I don't really talk about them in my dissertation just because it wasn't my focus and I needed to get done, right? And I'd still be writing, honestly, if I kept going. But there were a lot of women forest landowners in the early period. One in particular, Mira Lloyd Dock, if you want a great example. She owned a ton of land in Pennsylvania, and she offered it to the Yale Forestry School and had some summer field school ventures there. And so I know that there were a lot of women doing this current work. I'm just not as familiar with that research or that scholarship right now. So I don't know that I can answer that fully.
Fair enough. Mike Wertz mentions that women's clubs in the late 1800s and early 1900s played an important role. Is this also part of your research? He asks, what have you gathered so far? That falls under the, if we can put it into the bibliography, we will. But if you could just briefly address the role of women's clubs during the Progressive era and later, that'd be appreciated.
This, like I mentioned, it could have been a whole presentation just about progressive era women's clubs. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, there were millions of women who were a part of these clubs, botanical societies, gardening societies, all different kinds of focuses. I mentioned a lot about birds, and they were one of the key forces in driving a lot of legislation at the time. I forget which senator said it, but he wrote a letter back to this, I think the president of the Federation of Women's Clubs, and said, please call off your women. Stop. Because I'm just getting too much from them. Like they've made their point. And so these clubs were, in every town. And that's where I was talking about Margaret March Mount really clicked into these clubs and found an audience, found women who were really devoted to making a difference in their communities. And there's a lot of work there's a great article by Carolyn Merchant just on these women's clubs. I'll put that in the bibliography. But again, I could talk about them all day as well, but they're definitely a driving force in that progressive era period in pushing for environmental legislation.
I know the Daughters of the American Revolution got involved in conservation, starting with Pinchot's mother.
Yes.
And then at the time of their 50th anniversary, which was around 1942, they probably teamed up with Marchmount to do a huge planting program across the United States, where every state or chapter was to pledge they would plant at least 5 acres.
Right. Very similar to the Penny Pines program.
Yeah.
And I would encourage you to drive slowly when you're going through a forest. You'll see these signs that are, sometimes obscured by overgrowth, but they'll say, this forest was planted by the DAR or Penny Pines program, and they're still around today. So
yeah, women's organizations, not just the garden clubs, but others like the DAR were involved as well. Lena Pace says, as an environmental studies major, she's just blown away that she's never heard of these women, while of course she's been exposed to the Thoreaus and Pinchots of the world, which is why you were talking today. Now she asks, what can we do to get these stories into curriculums of schools? And then somebody else asks, how can we reach out to people? How can we leverage social media as well? And maybe, and that's Aaron. Sorry, hold on. So if we can talk a little bit about how we can start reaching the general public, school-age children, and then others, the adults.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, that's why I came on today to share this story. It's really important to me. I'm passionate about it, and I don't want to be the only one saying it. I know I'm not the only one saying it, but that's what I'm saying. We need to put this into mainstream discussion. When I go buy my little journal at Sam's Club, I'd like to see some women quoted, and not just, Lucy Maud Montgomery from Anne of Green Gables. I think how do we do that is we make an effort to look at sources differently. Like I said, look at the draft report, not the final. I would really encourage people, when they're putting a PowerPoint presentation together and they're talking about whatever topic, make sure a woman is on every single slide. Oftentimes what I see is, oh, we have this presentation and there's the women's slide. Please stop that. There's my plea for the day. Put a woman on every single slide, because women aren't relegated to one slide. They're pervasive throughout. And so I think if we can just rethink how we're presenting our information, how it is we are saying our stories, then we can slowly start to slide that into the, mainstream consciousness. And so it's going to start small. It starts with small things like this, but, I'm hopeful that more people will go pick up this fantastic book, Rachel Carson and Her Sisters by Robert Musil, who it's a little bit biography look at all these different women. And just make more of a concerted effort to look at untraditional sources. They're there. You just have to look.
I do want to give a shout out to Lauren Turner, who she's got a comment. She plugs Gloria Brown's memoir, Black Women in Green, Gloria Brown and Donna Sinclair, it's published by Oregon State University Press. And then and this is where I want to plug Lauren, a couple of years ago, she published a book, Outside Women.
Inside the Forest Service.
Inside the Forest Service. And she's working on a new one that's about to be published called Outdoor Women of Color Inside the Forest Service. She, in effect, with these two books, is kind of picking up from the civil rights women's movement era forward. So those are well worth seeking out, those books.
Definitely.
There was, let's see, bear with me, this is a long one. What was the intent of presenting so much male content today? I understand mentioning timelines to highlight women publishing or advocating prior to or concurrent to men, but not why more than a cursory touch occurred when you didn't have time for more content on women's contributions.
Sure. Is there more to it?
She said, especially harder to find documented people of color. So I'll ask, what was the process and your thinking in when you were putting this together?
Well, I wanted to assume that people were coming from maybe scratch, and so wanted to present with the idea that everybody could be caught up to speed in this presentation and not assume people's prior knowledge to this talk. And so that's why I wanted to set the stage with what that male conversation was, so we were all on the same page together, and then introduce what women had to say in that conversation as well. And so, like I said, I guess it's just making editorial choices right about and fitting in within time frame. But I did want to ensure that we were all on the same page before I just launched into all of these other things. I guess it's as simple as that.
Yeah, we have to understand what the historiography has been saying for decades.
Decades, right.
And in order to respond to it. And then once that's established, here's the problem, here's the response or
right. And so hopefully in future conversations, I can just launch right into all of those other cool things, and we'll already have that baseline from which we're all working from.
Let's see, there's somebody's offering up a book title, which I've not heard of. It's called Beyond Secretaries, Hostesses, and Cooks, The Power, Humility, and Compassion of Women Who Battled to Save Wilderness. As I said, I'm not familiar with it. Have you heard of this, Rachel?
No. Did Michelle put that in there?
It's an anonymous attendee. And
okay.
I will thank them. We're going to certainly look into that.
There's a Michelle Riley, who I've seen a little chat pop up from her. So check out her stuff on wilderness and women. She's also working on that. And I need help in this. I'm not the only person who can take on all of this material. So there's a lot out there, and I would encourage anybody interested in a project. There's so much that we could start to uncover together. I can't do it alone.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting. You brought up Ann Little's work, not dating, but covering the American Revolutionary period. That's just, I'll say it's like a 50-year period, and we're talking about centuries here. There is so much to delve into. There was an interesting suggestion of, wow, this would make a really great topic for a documentary film. Absolutely.
Yes, we think about this all the time, Jamie and I do.
Yeah, it's there's absolutely, and that ties back into the how do we reach school age kids? How do we reach an adult audience that doesn't want to pick up a book? Documentaries. I know that 2 chapters of my dissertation on the establishment of forestry education in the U.S. got pulled out and became a documentary film that we produced, that in one local screening, more people saw it than would have ever read my book version of the dissertation. And this is just crying out for multi-hour treatment. There's some, and well, I mean, we could talk about how to structure the film, but yeah, there's so much great biography to dive into. And if Ken Burns, if you're listening, we have already trademarked this, my friend. Back off. Up in Katie, oh boy, Katie, I'm not going to butcher your last name. I will be kind about this. She says she's an executive on the Forest History Association of Alberta up in Canada. And there's a lot of momentum for women in forestry in Canada at the moment. She wants to know if there's a way to contact you to discuss this. What I will point out is this fall, there will be a Women in Forestry Congress, an in-person meeting. I want to say it's in October. Do a search on that phrase, Women in Forestry Congress. This is gearing up to be a large gathering, but a critically important one as well, because it's bringing in, this is not a history conference. This is women in the various aspects of the profession of forestry coming together to talk, to network, and to address a lot of these issues that we historians are only starting to delve into. So by all means, look into that. Again, it's the Women in Forestry Congress. Look and see if, and to our Canadian friends, please look into that as well. Hopefully there are no issues with COVID and the border crossing and all that. It would be great if it's an international gathering, is my point. I'm not seeing any other questions. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude. Rachel, thank you very much for today's presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thank you all for joining.